Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you then please be sure to leave this video a like and to subscribe to my channel to see any more content like that. And today I am going to be bringing you another episode of Quick Movie Reviews. As with every segment of this that I do, I am going to be talking about many different movies that I've been seeing over the past month or so, and I'm going to try to do them and talk about them as quickly as I can, but if I do have more to say on a movie, then I will go ahead and do so. And once again, thank you for making these series do so well. They've continued to get great reception on my channel. So as long as that continues to be the case, I will continue to do them because it is a very convenient way to talk about a lot of different movies at the same time. But without further ado, we do have 7 movies on the docket to talk about today, so let's get started with the first movie I will be discussing. And first on the list, we have Smile 2, the sequel to the original movie that was actually a pretty pleasant surprise for me when I saw it. It may have been a little basic, and admittedly, the trauma horror genre has been done to death, but this movie gave a fresh enough spin on it that I liked, and plus the very dark and sort of depressing tone that it took on at the end gave it a unique flair that I really did enjoy. So I was very excited for the sequel because of how pleasant a surprise the first one was. And thankfully, I think this one delivers too. Now, it may not be quite as good as the first one. I do think this one tries to make everything bigger, and for the most part that works, but there is something valuable about the simplicity of the first that I do like. Nevertheless, I do enjoy that they tried to take it a different route and tried to expand the concept even more and take it into even crazier directions. I think this movie actually came out at a very timely manner, especially with this year a lot of conversation going around the idea of celebrity culture and how much our parasocial influences with celebrities are getting more toxic. And the answer to that question is that they are in fact getting even worse with the increase of social media and fans believing that they are entitled to every aspect of a celebrity's personal life. And that's a lot of what this movie plays into with in terms of the main character's trauma, is this idea that she's having to deal with a huge fan base and having to deal with people that are ranging from just weird, slightly creepy fans to ones that literally exhibit stalker behavior. I think that Naomi Scott as Sky Riley does an excellent job of portraying this paranoia. She goes even bigger with it, and I think it works because of just how big the trauma is that manifests around her. She sees it in far more extreme ways than the main character from the first movie does. And because of that, of course, she's going to lose her mind a little more, especially as people are not believing her and she is increasingly unsure of what is real and what is not. This one plays with your expectations even more, I think. I'm not going to say that this film has as many outright scary moments as the first one does, but this one still, even in the midst of its very big and over-the-top moments, it still does have those subtle scares in it that I really did like from the first movie, where things are just sort of there and they don't even comment on it, but that makes it all the more creepier. The performances all around in this movie are pretty great. I think that Naomi Scott does carry a lot of the weight on her shoulders. She's playing a character who is very, very flawed. I think she's a lot less likable than the main character in the first movie, but that is intentionally so. She, of course, has a little bit of that celebrity ego to her, and she also is going through huge problems with drug addiction that make her more unlikable than she probably would be without the drugs, but you still end up sympathizing for her in the midst of all this. The cold open of this movie in particular is superb. I love Kyle Gallner's performance as Joel in this sequence. He was good in the first Smile, but he might be even better here, even though he's not in the movie for that long. It leaves you with a huge impact. I think the horror elements of this movie are pretty fun. I think they work pretty well. There are a couple points where it just felt like maybe the scares were a little bit too much and they weren't really as scary as the movie was intending them to be. But then there were some that were clearly meant to be over the top and you were meant to sort of uncomfortably laugh at. So those moments did work. Now, if I were to delve into any problems with the movie, I would say that probably the biggest is this movie feels like it runs a little bit too long. There's a point in the movie where you start getting the point and you feel like it should be ending at this point, but then it keeps on going and it does feel like it overstays its welcome a little bit too much. Also, I do think that the movie's logic becomes a little confusing at a certain point of the movie, especially with a twist they do with Sky Riley's friend Gemma. And while I did see the twist coming eventually, it still makes you wonder how much of the movie and how much of the plot really happened. That is not a huge problem when you do have an ending that is very impactful. I think if, considering the subject matter of the movie and considering that it is about a singer, especially a very popular singer, that the ending of the movie is one that you sort of see coming. You sort of see that it's going to come to this inevitable conclusion. And it certainly has some very big implications for where the series could go in part 3. I think that they have put themselves in a very interesting situation that I think they could have a lot of fun with if they pursue it in the correct way. And I sort of have faith that they will, because this is a very good sequel. I'm not sure if it's quite as good as the first, but it is very good in its own right, and it sees the movie pushing its concept in interesting directions. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. If you like mainstream horror, then I think you'll enjoy this movie. Even if you're not a big horror fan, I think this one can appeal to you. So yeah, check this one out if you haven't. Next up, I'm going to talk about the movie Here, which was directed by Robert Zemeckis and stars Tom Hanks and Robin Wright. I don't know if they've been together in a movie since Forrest Gump, but it feels sort of purposeful because Robert Zemeckis has also directed Forrest Gump, and those two were in that movie together as well. This movie had an interesting concept that had me intrigued going in. The idea behind this movie is that the whole movie takes place in literally one room / one location. It never moves the camera beyond that location. It keeps it steady in this one area the whole time, and we see different lives being played out through this room, and sometimes going back as far as before buildings even existed, but with the majority of the meat of the story taking place with Tom Hanks and Robin Wright's characters, Richard and Margaret, as they go through their relationship and the struggles and joys that it had throughout it. Sadly, what I got, I don't think is as solid as I would have wanted it to be. In fact, it felt like it just didn't really work to me on many levels. First of all, I think the movie likes its gimmick a little too much, and it seems to care more about that than it does about the story itself. Like, it's trying to play with all these interesting ideas with how they're going to transition between time periods without moving the camera. And yeah, it just does feel a little gimmicky, which is unfortunately, I feel like, what Robert Zemeckis has become lately. One of the biggest problems is that I just don't find much reason to care for the central relationship between Richard and Margaret. Neither of them are particularly interesting characters and feel like cliches of relationships that you see in Hallmark movies all the time, although I do appreciate the movie makes their relationship flow maybe a little more realistically, and it doesn't necessarily end where you would have expected it to, at least initially. But the movie sort of turns back on that and makes it overtly sentimental at the end in a way that I just don't think felt earned, especially how they were talking about the relationship in the beginning parts of the movie. Also, I think it is a little bothersome that we are constantly interrupted with their relationship in the movie by these other relationships that really don't matter much at the end of the day, and just feel like a way to show the room in different time periods so that there can be impressive set pieces, or even more perplexingly, Robert Zemeckis incorporates historical figures into this, like he incorporates Benjamin Franklin and his family into this movie, and it is very weird because it literally goes almost nowhere, I would say. And then there's this very perplexing storyline with the guy who is apparently the inventor of the Lazy Boy chair. It is such a perplexing one, and the laughs that they try to incorporate in it just feel like not earned at all, and they don't work. And it is a particularly silly story that I didn't see the point of incorporating into this movie at all. Probably the best side story was the one with Pauline, played by Michelle Dockery, and her husband, who is a pilot, and they're in a time period where flying is a new thing, just recently getting started, and she is very worried about her husband flying off and is concerned about the dangers of that. But once again, that story also feels like it just cuts off too early, and we don't really get enough time to know the characters to truly care. While the main story is a little better, I just don't think it really works that well. And I think a lot of that has to do with the performances in this movie. The performances just aren't that good. I think Tom Hanks is surprisingly bad in this movie. It's especially awkward when he's playing the younger version of himself, and I wonder if that has to partly do with the special effects they use to de-age him. While the de-aging does look, for the most part, pretty impressive in some ways, there's also other ways that it looks a bit uncanny valley, and it seems like he never really truly emotes when he's in his younger state. And what's even stranger is that the de-aging works a little better on Robin Wright as Margaret. She does look more lively when she's younger, and it looks more realistic. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's just something that I could not help but notice. I think Paul Bettany, for as much as I do like him as an actor, is very over the top in this movie, and because of that, I had really no reason to sympathize with him. I don't know, this movie had some cool ideas, but I think its gimmick became its focus, and because of that, the characters became boring. I did not really care for this one at all. I'm gonna give this a 2 out of 5 stars with not much of a recommendation. Alright, next up I'm going to be talking about the movie Anora, definitely one of my most anticipated movies of the year, especially after seeing all the hype that was built up around it. And I was really hopeful that the movie would, in fact, live up to its hype, and I would say it did. I think this is a great movie. Now, admittedly, I have not seen any other Sean Baker films, and yeah, I think that might look bad on someone who is a professed fan of movies, and Sean Baker is a very well-liked director now. I really liked the storyline behind this, about a sex worker who meets a very rich person and sort of falls for them, but it's also sort of obvious that they want to be with them for their money, but they are on equal playing grounds because Ivan alternately just sort of wants Annie for the sex, obviously. And so they are sort of on an equal playing field in terms of that, but they do still seem to have a genuine chemistry in the movie that can't be denied, and so they do eventually get married to one another after only being with each other for about a week or so. But Ivan's family, it turns out, are very prolific Russians who are also a bit shady characters. His family does not want Ivan to get married to Annie because of societal expectations, and they have a very negative view of sex workers. So they come to America to try to annul the marriage, much to the chagrin of Annie, who tries to fight against it. But eventually, it seems like she is having to be forced to do so because of the dangerous people surrounding them, which leads to a far more dangerous but also very interesting to watch situation unfold. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on in this movie that I really did enjoy, and I think I have to primarily start with the really great performances in this movie. This has some of the best performances that I have seen this year so far. Mikey Madison, in particular, as Annie, is just superb. She embodies this character very believably, and I think she really shows the three-dimensionality of this character. I like that Sean Baker is giving characters like her so much agency in this movie, and I think really just makes her very complex. You see that she wants to get out of this situation that she's in. She doesn't necessarily want to be a sex worker for the rest of her life, but also she feels a bit trapped in it because of the cycle that she is stuck in. But also, she doesn't like when people look down on her for her situation because of their preconceived notions about her, even though that is not only who she is. Mark Eidelstein is also great as Ivan, playing this very rich type that has a little bit of a frat-like personality, but once again, it also isn't just that. But you can see the cracks in his persona show as the movie keeps on going, and especially how much influence his parents hold over him, and that eventually you do see that maybe he doesn't hold the real care for Annie that he claims to throughout a part of the movie, and it is tragic when that layer starts to reveal itself. And then there's Yura Borisov as Igor, who I think should be in conversation in the awards season. He plays his role mainly silent. He doesn't have a whole lot of dialogue, but you still get the personality type of this character right off the page. There's also a hugely funny performance by Karen Karagulian. He is hilarious in this movie, along with Vach Tovmasan. They are both so funny in this movie. And speaking of which, yeah, this movie, for as dark as it can get, is also very funny. There is a particular scene in this movie where they're invading Ivan's house, where his parents have finally found out that he's married to Annie, and his parents essentially send people that work for them to retrieve Ivan and to annul the marriage. And the whole scene where they're going into their house and trying to retrieve Ivan and get Annie away to annul the marriage is so funny. I mean, it is absolutely hilarious. One of the best executed scenes of the year, I think. I just couldn't stop laughing at all the twists and turns that this scene takes. This movie is a tragicomedy in every sense of the word, and I think it works in that genre very well. Also, it shouldn't go amiss without saying that there's some beautiful visual moments in this movie. I love in particular, the moments after Ivan and Annie get married, and you see them just simply enjoying life on the Vegas Strip, and the music that plays over it is very fitting, but the visuals are just gorgeous. And the ending shots of this movie are also very memorable, in complete contrast with the dismal snow going on in the background and the very dark, cramped camera angles that go on inside the car as Annie leaves Igor behind. There's just so many different meshing moments of this movie that make it feel like a very whole and very well done experience. And the end of the movie in particular, I think, just sort of leaves you speechless with what it does. I think it is very well done. If anything, I think that maybe there were a couple points in the beginning of the movie where it took a while to get where it was going, and maybe it could have progressed to those points a little faster, but still, it wasn't really that big of a problem to me. I really loved this movie a lot. It is one of my favorite movies of the year so far. Strong 4 out of 5 stars to a solid 4.5 out of 5 stars for me. I would definitely recommend this one. Next up is Anna Kendrick's directorial debut, Woman of the Hour, which is based off a true story where a woman who goes by the name of Cheryl Bradshaw goes on to a game show as an aspiring actress, and she, in this game show, which was a dating game show, by the way, where she encounters 3 different mystery contestants who she doesn't know, and she has to choose one of them to go on a date with. One of the contestants happens to also be a serial killer. And yeah, the movie goes forward with that very twisted and interesting premise, and I think does pretty well with it. I think for a directorial debut, this is pretty solid, although I will say that the movie is not entirely perfect. I think, actually, I can start out with one of the main issues, is that the movie does go into the perspective of the many different girls that this serial killer encounters. And out of all of them, I would actually say that Cheryl is the least intriguing. It is interesting that a game show contestant would just so happen to be on a game show where a serial killer is also present. That is definitely more newsworthy in many obvious ways, but I think there are other characters in this that are more interesting, other girls that become victims of Ken, the serial killer. What we do get out of this movie is still a pretty solid experience. I think that the performances are good in here. Anna Kendrick is great as Cheryl Bradshaw. This is probably one of my favorite performances of hers to date. I think she really does play this character very well. I think that Max Lloyd-Jones is pretty terrifying as Ken. I think this is a pretty creepy interpretation of a serial killer, and it works well for the tone of the movie. Nicolette Robinson is particularly interesting in this as a character who recognizes the serial killer in the movie, and she recognizes him as the person who probably killed one of her friends many years back. I really like the reaction she has to him, feels very believable and very heart-wrenching, and I thought she delivered well. Tony Hale was good as the game show host, although he didn't have a very big or particularly consequential role. I still did think he portrayed this very misogynistic role well. And yeah, there's really not too much to say about this movie. In terms of a true crime-esque movie, I think it presents the story well. I think it presents the victims with a touch of sensitivity, and I think it does a good job at developing the serial killer and making him pretty intimidating while also giving him a bit of a vulnerable side, but that alternately makes the dark side of him that much more creepy. The other negative aspects of this movie, I guess, is that it's a little basically presented, I think, and I do think that because it has so many different victims that it's trying to pay attention to, the rest of the stories don't really come across as interesting as they probably should have. But still, this was a decent enough movie, and I did enjoy what I got out of it. Solid 3 out of 5 stars for me. Next up is the movie Don't Move, a Netflix original, which I was intrigued by mainly for the fact that it was produced by Sam Raimi, and what I got out of it was, I think, a pretty solid, although admittedly pretty basic horror experience, where you've got the predator and the prey. It's something very familiar that you have seen before. We've got two main characters in this, Kelsey Esbell as Iris, and Finn Wittrock as Richard. Iris is struggling with the death of her son, and at the beginning of the movie is going on a hiking trail to take her own life. But Finn Wittrock's character Richard stops her and sort of encourages her to keep moving forward, but obviously he has some ulterior motives. As they are both returning from the hiking trail together, he eventually stabs something into her, but it is eventually revealed that the substance essentially keeps her from moving. All her motor functions cease to exist, and she cannot move or cannot talk, and is basically a vegetable in the definition of the word. So the movie is all about essentially Iris finding her desire for life again after trying to take it, and reclaiming the passion for living each day as if it were her last. It is admittedly a bit of a cliched premise, but I do think that it generally works in the way that they present it. I think a lot of that does have to do with the believability of the two lead performances. I think Kelsey Esbell is really solid as Iris. I wouldn't say her performance is like jaw-dropping or groundbreaking or anything like that, but she does play this character in a believable way, and I think gives her a nice sympathetic edge where you do want her to get out of this alive. You care for her. Finn Wittrock is fittingly intimidating as Richard. I really liked the performances he brought in American Horror Story. I always thought he was one of the stronger actors in that series. So I liked seeing him in another more intimidating role in this movie. And while this is definitely a killer type you have seen before, the type that seems to be very charismatic and very caring, but obviously has something darker going on underneath the surface, I still do think he plays a role well enough to make it work fine. But I think that does bring to one of the main problems of the movie. Everything here is just sort of fine. I liked the movie while I watched it, but admittedly I didn't think much about it after I was done with it. It's not particularly scary. I don't think it was trying to be. It was more of a thriller, but also I didn't find it to be as tense as it could have been. Now, I do think the climax of the movie was pretty solid. I do think that's where the movie shined the brightest. Also, the protagonist's motive, or rather the antagonist's motivation, Richard's motivation, is a little confusing in places. I'm not exactly sure what his ultimate desire is with Iris, especially since it is revealed later in the movie that he has a family. but nevertheless, it does make him a little less of an intriguing killer than he could have been. Still, this movie was overall fine. I do think it is a fun experience while you are watching it. Just don't expect to necessarily go out feeling very impressed by what you've seen. Still, decent 3 out of 5 stars for me. Next up is the movie Heretic, which was definitely one I was very intrigued by because of the trailers. I was particularly excited to see Hugh Grant coming into his own as a villain role. I thought it seems like it would be something he would do a good job at, and coming out of the movie, I would say that that is the case. I think he was definitely the strongest element of this movie by a long shot. But if you don't know, this is a movie about two Mormon girls, Sister Barnes and Sister Paxton, who are looking to convert people to their church, and they eventually stumble upon Mr. Reed's house, and he invites them in to talk more about their beliefs. But they eventually discover that Mr. Reed is maybe not all he seems to be, and that he might have a bigger plan than he initially let them on with about testing them and their faith. The idea behind this movie, I think, is very interesting. I found this movie to be intriguing in its philosophical conversations about religion in particular. A24 has made religious movies in the past with elements of it in them, but I don't think that they've ever made a movie, or acquired a movie rather, where religion is talked about in such detail as it is in this one. You're not necessarily going to hear anything new in here, but I think it does help that the conversations are done in a way that is more interesting than you might initially expect. And a lot of that does also have to do with the really good performances in this movie. I think the performances were very necessary to make this movie stand up above the rest, because this movie is more of a conversational movie than it is one where a lot of horror action is going on. Hugh Grant is simply great as Mr. Reed. I think he gives a very strong performance here. He plays a character very creepy, but also very funny. There are parts where you feel creeped out by him, but are also wanting to laugh at the things that he's saying. And it's intentionally so. It's obviously meant to be that tone. And I think that the sisters both matched that well in terms of both playing a little bit more straight in terms to Mr. Reed's very unhinged character. Sophie Thatcher was good as Sister Barnes, who was clearly the more intelligent Mormon, or more experienced, you could say, the one who had had more experience in the religion, whereas Chloe East as Sister Paxton was playing the one that was a little more naive and was discovering more about the religion. Now, unfortunately, the horror elements of this movie outside of the conversations were a bit of a mixed bag. I think a lot of that has to do with the movie over-explaining the scares in this movie. The tests, specifically, that Mr. Reed does on the sisters to try to basically show them that their faith is not real. But the tests, I think it would have been better if they were left a little bit of a mystery in terms of how he delivered them, especially this miracle test that he does. I think it was ultimately very odd that Sister Paxton could figure out so much, especially because she was the more naive of the two, and plus, the fact that the movie over-explains so much, I think it does slightly insult the intelligence of the audience, where I don't think we really needed everything to be over-explained to us. Still, overall, I did enjoy this movie. I did find it to be a pretty fun experience while I was watching it, but after I was done with it, I did admittedly feel left wanting a bit more. So I would say this is more of a mid-tier A24 movie. Not a bad one, but definitely not one of their best either. Solid 3 out of 5 stars. It's a good experience while you're watching it, but I do think that you can get better, and you can definitely get better horror from this year alone. And finally, let's end off talking about the movie Conclave, which is about the death of the Pope and the Catholic Church, and the election of finding a new Pope, and all the political intrigue that goes on in the midst of that, as well as our main character, Father Lawrence, dealing with the struggles of having a faith crisis. And essentially not feeling sure if the church can move forward or not in the midst of where it's at in the cultural times, and if the church is even really a good institution anymore. Conclave as a film has a lot of things going for it, but I think the main thing it has going for it is the political intrigue in the movie in the midst of this new papal election. Now, if you're not a fan of political intrigue, then you'll probably find this movie to be pretty dull, because it is a movie of a lot of talking about this election that's going on with the Pope. But I found it to be very interesting. You're always wondering in the back of your mind, is Lawrence himself interested in being the Pope as much as he claims to not really want the main seat? Is there a part of him that still wants it? And that is always playing in the movie as another form of him trying to vie for power, or maybe not vying for power, because it does also seem that his faith crisis is playing a role in him maybe realizing that he would not be a good fit for the Pope role. And then there's all the different ideals of religion that are being discussed in the movie, and as to which one we should adhere to and which one would be most valuable. Even with those conversations about the church progressing or regressing, there's also the idea of if it will really matter much at the end of the day if the church is already in so much disunity. It's all very interestingly done and held up by a plethora of excellent performances. Ralph Fiennes puts on one of probably my favorite performances of the year in Lawrence. He plays his character very well. I wish the movie had explored his crisis of faith a little more. I think that would have been interesting. But nevertheless, the political intrigue with him is done very well. Stanley Tucci as Bellini puts on an understated performance that I think is in danger of going underrated. I thought it was very well done and very interesting to watch. John Lithgow was great as Tremblay as well, and I wish I would have seen a little more of him. Carlos Diaz was great as Benitez. I mean, just such an interesting character that you don't necessarily see where he's going to go, but at the end of the movie, it is very surprising, but in a pleasant way, where his character ends up, and I really liked where they took him. And then there's also the very understated character of Sister Agnes, played by Isabella Rossellini, that has her own agenda in this movie that's very interesting to watch. The score in this movie is well done, although at some points I do think it plays it maybe a little bit too over the top. There are definitely points where the score is trying to tell you how important an event is, and I don't necessarily think that was necessary. But then there are other places where the tense score works very well and leaves you leaning forward in your seat, interested to see what's going to happen next. If there were any flaws with this movie, and there really aren't that many, I would say that the biggest, and this one does count a couple points against this movie, is the final last-minute twist they have with the character who does eventually win Pope in this movie. I felt the twist was maybe a little bit unnecessary. I think the message of the movie came across well enough already with who did win the Pope seat, but they pushed it forward in a way that, I don't know, it just felt like it came out of nowhere. It didn't offend me or anything, but it felt like they just wanted to have one last-minute surprise just to keep you on your toes. But nevertheless, some people are going to like having this even bigger twist in the movie, but some are also going to feel that it maybe reduces what made a good movie already good. Nevertheless, I did still really enjoy this movie. I think it is one of my favorites of the year, maybe not quite top 10, but this was a very solid religious political thriller that I found to be very interesting, with a lot of great performances that I think are going to get recognized in the award season. Strong 4 out of 5 stars for me. So yeah, that ends this episode of Quick Movie Reviews. What were your thoughts on any of the movies I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.